Hey guys, welcome to Infinite Sky. A Boeing 777 is preparing to land and the pilot is extremely nervous because it is his first time performing a manual landing without the autopilot. If he makes a mistake today, his promotion could be at risk. Under this stress, he made a critical error that placed the aircraft in serious trouble. What exactly happened? Let's find out in today's video. On July 6, 2013, a Boeing 777 operated by Asiana Airlines, call sign Flight 214, was preparing to depart from Incheon International Airport in South Korea. This plane was headed from South Korea to San Francisco International Airport in the United States. This is San Francisco International Airport. It has 4 runways. It has 2 parallel runway pairs and all 4 intersect in a crossing pattern. Behind runways 28 left and right, there's water. As a result, the runway lights and instrument antennas are positioned directly in the water. This airport is one of the busiest airports in the world. The flight was going to be pretty long, almost 11 hours. There were a total of 4 pilots on the flight, 3 captains and 1 first officer. At this time, Captain Lee Jeon-ming was seated in the right-hand seat, normally assigned to the first officer. He was 49 years old, and besides being a captain, he was also an instructor. He had 12,337 flight hours of experience, including 3,220 hours on the Boeing 777. In the captain's seat was Lee Kang-kook, who was 45 years old. Although he had accumulated 9,793 flight hours, he had logged only 43 hours on the Boeing 777, providing him with very limited experience on this aircraft type. Today's flight was assigned to him as a part of his training. Asiana Airlines provides initial operating experience training to its new pilots. Captain Lee Kang, who was sitting in the captain's seat, hadn't finished his training yet. Although his training was still ongoing, his performance was pretty good. He was picking things up quickly. Perhaps that is why he was reluctant to reveal his weaknesses, fearing it might negatively affect his training record. This attitude later played a significant role in the accident. Anyway, besides these 2, a relief first officer Bong Dong was sitting in the jump seat. He had about 4,500 hours of flight experience, including 715 hours on the Boeing 777. There was also a relief captain, Lee Jong-ju, who was sitting in a passenger seat in the cabin. The aircraft was carrying 291 passengers, primarily from China, South Korea, and United States. Apart from these passengers, there were 12 crew members, 8 in the front part of the plane and 4 in the back. Finally, at 3:30 a.m., Asiana Airlines Flight 214 was ready to take off. After all the procedures, the plane sped down the runway and took off. Normally, this flight was supposed to last 10 to 11 hours, but since it took off at 3 a.m., the pilots hadn't slept that night. So to make sure the pilots could get some rest, there were 2 extra relief pilots on board. Anyway, within a short while the plane was flying at its maximum altitude. There were no issues at all with the plane. The weather was perfectly clear. Just a few hours into the flight, the captain went to rest, and the relief captain and relief first officer took their places in the cockpit. They were the ones flying the plane until morning. After a few hours, around 9:55 a.m., both pilots swapped seats. Lee Kang went back to the captain's seat and the instructor took the pilot's seat again. It is important to note that this captain was still in training and had only 43 hours of experience on the Boeing 777. The entire responsibility of landing was on the newbie pilot. While the captain was just there to give instructions, as the plane was approaching San Francisco Airport, the pilot's anxiety kept growing because he already knew that the glide slope at the airport was under maintenance. The glide slope is an ILS technology that helps keep the plane at an angle between 2.8 to 3.5 degrees. If the plane goes above or below the glide slope, it could crash either before the runway or just past it. So it's really important for a plane to stay in its glide slope to land the plane safely. Normally the ILS installed at the airport automatically guides the plane onto the glide slope, but for Flight 214, this facility wasn't available because the glide slope was under maintenance. So the captain had to do a visual approach, meaning he had to look at the runway and manually adjust the plane's altitude up or down. They also had the airport chart, which showed what the plane's altitude should be at specific waypoints. For example, at the Heyman waypoint, the plane's altitude should be 3,100 feet, and at Duyet it should be 1,800 feet. If it wasn't, then the plane wouldn't be able to land safely. The captain only had 43 flight hours of experience on the Boeing 777, and the surprising thing is that before this he had never landed a plane visually without a glide slope. The captain didn't want the instructor to know he was nervous, otherwise his training would have been delayed even more. Therefore, he pretended to be fully confident in his actions. Additionally, Asiana Airlines had a policy of maximizing automation during flights, meaning they aimed to operate the flights automatically as much as possible. Whether it was landing or any other phase of the flight, the focus was on relying on the automatic system. Maybe that's why the captain was making a visual approach on the Boeing 777 without losing the glide slope for the first time. The captain started lowering the altitude gradually. Even though the glide slope at the airport wasn't working, the localizer was still operational. The localizer assists in aligning the aircraft with the runway center line. Flight 214 was lined up with the runway. Meanwhile, ATC gave permission to land on runway 28 left. Another United Airlines aircraft was waiting on the taxiway for the same runway. They were waiting for Asiana Airlines Flight 214 to land so they could take off from that runway. ATC was also waiting for the Asiana pilots to confirm that they had landed, but unfortunately, that never happened. A loud impact was heard from the runway, and the controller observed smoke rising from its center. An emergency alert was immediately issued. When the rescue team arrived, they found that the plane's tail was missing. The rescue operation began right away. No one knew why or how the accident happened. At this location, the plane's tail, plane's fuselage, and many small parts of the aircraft were scattered all over the airport. The right engine was still attached to the plane's wing, but it was on fire. The plane's engine contains engine oil, which was leaking rapidly, causing the fire to grow stronger. 2 emergency slides deployed correctly, but 2 inflated inside the cabin, blocking the exits. However, there's an axe in the cockpit. Using that axe, they cleared the path. A lot of people ask me why there's an axe on the plane. The answer is that it can be used in emergencies. In addition, 1 slide deployed in the middle of the cabin, but a flight attendant cut it through with a knife to clear the way. Many passengers seated in the rear of the aircraft evacuated through the fractured fuselage. 4 flight attendants who were sitting in the back of the plane fell along out. When the tails separated, 4 flight attendants who were sitting in the back of the plane fell out along with their seats. Of the 307 people on board, 304 survived the accident. 3 people lost their lives. At the time of the crash, a United Airlines plane was waiting to take off from the same airport. Because of this, many passengers recorded the incident on their phones. Flight attendant Yoon Hye assisted passengers until the very end and was the last person to evacuate the burning aircraft. After the accident, she was treated like a hero. But then the fire got even worse, which can be seen in this real image. When it comes to Boeing, a lot of questions were raised about safety, like what about the slide on the plane that's supposed to help people to quickly evacuate in emergency? How did it end up deploying inside the plane during the emergency? The slide is meant for emergencies to save lives, not just 1 or 2, but 3 slides deployed inside the aircraft, raising a serious safety concern. NBC even raised questions about it, and after this accident, when the database was checked, there were not just a few or 100, but thousands of complaints about this slider. Still, Boeing kept brushing everyone off, acting like they could silence the issue. Maybe that's why no improvements were made despite so many complaints. Operational negligence was also observed at the airport. During the accident, many injured people were taken out and left at some distance. so that even if a fire broke out, they would be safe. So many people were hurt and couldn't even walk. They were just left lying wherever they were dropped. That was bad enough, but the negligence was on another level. A fire truck ran over a girl while passing through. Her family filed a case, saying their daughter was alive, but that truck crushed her and killed her. Later, they even said she was already dead. Like, does that make any sense? It was unclear whether the rescue team had verified if she was still alive before the incident. In all that time, they could have taken the truck from the other side. It wasn't even dark, so you can't just say it happened by mistake. And even if she had died, would you just run the truck over her like that? Anyway, after this crash, a lot of questions started coming up. How did such a huge crash even happen? We got the answers from the investigation report. So let's try once again to understand the whole incident based on the investigation report. Let's start looking into this case when the plane was approaching to the airport to land. It was flying at almost 6,000 feet altitude. Considering the distance to the airport, the plane was flying a bit higher than usual. The captain maintained vertical speed, engaged the auto throttle, and set the minimum descent altitude at 4,600 feet. Now the plane would keep descending until it reached 4,600 feet. If there was any problem with the landing, the captain had already set a missed approach altitude of 3,000 feet to abort the landing and go around. The plane was descending at a speed of 133 knots. The weather was perfectly clear. The captain contacted ATC. ATC said you can land on the runway 28 left. Around 10:30, the captain completed the descent checklist. Meanwhile, the relief first officer and relief captain, who were resting, also came into the cockpit. ATC said, "Can you see the runway?" The instructor said yes. Then ATC gave landing clearance. At this time, the plane was flying at about 5,300 feet altitude, moving towards the runway at almost 210 knots. In just a little while, the plane's automatic system detected the localizer. As we discussed earlier, the localizer assists in aligning the aircraft with the runway centerline. As a result, the captain had no difficulty aligning with the centerline, as the autopilot guided the aircraft onto it. The captain just had to maintain the altitude since that facility wasn't available at the airport. Now the plane needed to reach the Heman point where its altitude should be 3,100 feet. It was around 11:20 in the morning when the pilot set the next altitude to 1,800 feet, right at Duyet Point. Meanwhile, ATC told them to maintain a speed of 180 knots until they were 5 nautical miles from the runway. At that moment, the plane was flying at almost 250 knots. The plane was now slowly descending to 1,800 feet. Following ATC's instructions, they reduced the speed to 180 knots. At that point, the flaps were set at 5 degrees. However, a problem soon emerged. The plane needed to go down, but suddenly its nose started lifting up. The question was, why did that happen? For understanding this, we need to understand how the autopilot works. The autopilot has several modes, and one of them is called level change. For example, if a plane is flying at 5,000 feet and the pilot sets the altitude to something lower, let's say 4,000 feet, then the pilot's autopilot throttle will go to idle and hold that position. The display also indicates when the system is in hold mode. Since the plane needs to descend, the autopilot will start pushing the plane's nose down. During this time, if the pilot feels that the speed has dropped too low, so they can manually push the throttle forward. But that's if the pilot set the plane's altitude lower than the current altitude. Now, what if the plane's altitude is 5,000 feet and the pilot set it to 6,000 feet? In that case, the auto throttle will automatically start increasing the engine power. At this moment, the plane was flying at 3,000 feet and the pilot set the altitude to 1,800 feet, which is lower than the pilot's current altitude. The result was that the auto throttle idled the engine thrust. At this point, the plane's speed was almost 250 knots, but ATC had instructed to maintain the plane speed at 180 knots. So the pilot set the plane speed to 180 knots. As a result, the autopilot pitched the nose up to reduce the speed to 180 knots and idled the engine thrust. Here, if the pilot thought there was something wrong with the speed, they could have manually increased the speed themselves, but no one in the cockpit even glanced at the throttle. At the due point, Flight 214 should have been at 1,800 feet, but was instead at 2,250 feet, 450 feet higher than required. After crossing this waypoint, the captain set the missed approach altitude to 3,000 feet. Even though the plane was about to reach 2,000 feet, maybe he thought that if they needed to abort the landing, they could go up to 3,000 feet. To do this, the captain had to press the FLCH or Flight Level Change button. Everyone was forced on getting the plane's altitude on the glide slope. From the start, the plane's altitude was always higher than it should be. Even the captain reduced the plane's speed from 180 knots to 172 knots. At that time, the descent rate was increased from 900 feet per minute to 1000 feet per minute to bring the plane down faster. But the plane still felt too high. So the captain increased the descent rate from 1000 feet per minute to 1500 feet per minute. Such a rapid descent rate was unsafe. That's when the instructor said, set the vertical speed back to 1000. So again, the vertical speed was set to 1000. The speed was reduced from 172 knots to 152 knots. The flaps were set to 30. Meanwhile, the captain activated the FLCH switch. This marked the beginning of a chain of critical errors. At this point, the plane's altitude was below 2000 feet, but the captain had set the target altitude to 3000 feet, which was higher than the current altitude. After activating the flight level change, the autopilot should have increased the plane's thrust so it could climb from 2000 to 3000 feet. But the problem was that the plane's speed had already been lowered from 172 knots to 152 knots. Basically, the plane's speed was supposed to be reduced from 172 knots to 152 knots, and the altitude was supposed to be increased to 3000 feet, which was impossible. To raise the altitude, the plane's engine power would have to be increased, but the auto throttle was told to reduce the plane's speed. So the autopilot tried to bring the speed down to 152 knots while at the same time trying to climb. Obviously, that just couldn't happen. It was comparable to a driver simultaneously braking and expecting the car to accelerate. The auto throttle was in hold mode, meaning it remained dead idle while the target speed was reached. Sure, if the pilot felt the plane was slowing down, they could manually increase the thrust, but all 4 pilots in the cockpit were focused outside, not inside. No one paid attention to the speed or the indicator. Meanwhile, the flaps, landing gear, speed brakes, vertical speed settings, and auto throttle collectively reduced the aircraft speed. The plane was above the glide slope at the first. As a result, the plane was above the glide slope at first, but then it crossed the glide slope and even went below it. Like I mentioned at the start of the video, if the plane goes above or below the glide slope, in either case it can lead to a crash. There was another technology at the airport that could have prevented this accident, and that was the PAPI lights. The captain saw 4 PAPI lights. All 4 lights were white. Just so you know, during a visual approach when landing the plane on the glide slope, PAPI lights really help the pilot. If the plane is flying above the glide slope, the pilot sees 4 white lights. If it's a bit higher, 1 red and 3 white lights show up. When the plane is right on the glide slope, there are 2 white lights and 2 red lights. If the plane is a little below, 3 red lights and 1 white light appear. And if the plane is way below the glide slope, the pilot will see 4 red lights. Observing 4 red lights indicates a critical danger of being far below the glide path. Now the plane had almost reached 1000 feet altitude, but it should have been at 750 feet by now. So it was still 250 feet too high. Because of this, the captain first increased the descent rate from 1000 feet per minute to 1500 feet per minute. Then he bumped it up to 1800 feet per minute. The plane started descending so fast that the sensors thought it was falling. That's when the alarm went off in the cockpit. Sink rate, sink rate. It was warning about the rapidly dropping altitude. In response to this, the captain pulled the yoke back, but the thrust was still at idle. The plane's nose started to lift, setting a higher vertical speed, speed brakes, flaps, landing gear down, auto throttle at idle. All worked together to slow the plane down. As a result, the plane, which was earlier above the glide slope, crossed it and went below. The pilot had been seeing 4 white lights indicating the plane was too high and needed to come down. Now those had turned into 4 red lights, signaling that the plane had gone too low and could crash. In the cockpit, the sink rate alarm, ground proximity warning, landing gear alerts, and all kinds of alarms started going off. The plane was so low that even the wheels were cutting through the water as it moved forward. Then it hit the boundary rocks. The impact was so severe that both landing gears collapsed. The tail section separated, and the fuselage skidded nearly 2,400 feet before coming to rest after about 90 seconds. There were many reasons behind this accident. The airline company was relying completely on an automatic system, due to which the pilot couldn't manually control the plane properly. They even handed over the manual landing to a pilot who had never before landed a plane manually without a glide slope or ILS system. Even the instructor sitting in the pilot's seat was on their first flight as an instructor pilot. The captain flying the plane never told the instructor about his fear or hesitation in manually landing the plane because he wanted to hide his weakness. The instructor pilot could have taken control or initiated a go-around, but the pilot was so panicked that maybe his mind didn't work properly at the last moment. There were 4 pilots in the cockpit. All 4 should have been focusing on the instruments. Besides that, this crash also exposed Boeing's negligence. Even after receiving not hundreds but thousands of complaints, they hadn't fixed the issue with the Boeing 777 slides. Luckily in this accident, all the passengers had already gotten out of the plane. But who knows when some accident might happen.